Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Zechariah chapters 9 through 11, where we read of enemies within and without. The book of Zechariah has been divided into three main sections. You had eight visions that were actually oriented where there's a certain symmetry to those visions. Then two sermons, or we called it last time a two-part sermon in chapters 7 and 8. And now we come to two burdens. The first of these starts in chapter 9 and runs to the end of chapter 11. And it's going to be a judgment on the enemies of Israel. Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord. Now, when we look at that phrase, the burden, the Hebrew there is often translated an oracle. So you could have gone the oracle of the word of the Lord. However, this is actually quite literal because that term for oracle also can be used to describe something that is just heavy and it's a burden that has to be carried. So I think burden works nicely. The burden of the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach. And you say, well, where on earth is Hadrach? Well, we're not entirely sure. It's not a term that we're used to hearing. But what we are told is some of the places that are in and around it, and I think that helps us. So notice, with Damascus as its resting place for the eyes of men, especially of all the tribes of Israel, are toward the Lord, and Hamath also, which borders on it, and then notice Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. And so the burden is against this place called Hadrach, but then we have the other cities that are around the area of Levant. Let's look at a map. Here's a map showing, and notice you see Hamath in the north, and then the port cities of Sidon and Tyre. Damascus is inland. I put Jerusalem just to get your bearings. So this area of Hadrach seems to be that area of the Levant. Notice extending all the way in toward Damascus and Hamath, but extending up the coast of the Mediterranean. Chapter 9, verse 3, for Tyre built herself a fortress and piled up silver like dust and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will dispossess her and cast her wealth into the sea, and she will be consumed with fire. Now, this sounds a lot like a prophecy that we had back in Ezekiel chapter 26, a prophecy about Tyre that talked about how Tyre would be cast into the sea. That literally happened. You see, here's a map of Tyre. You've got the mainland city of Tyre that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. The king of Babylon came and destroyed that mainland city. But the people of Tyre had, for the most part, moved out to the island. It's about half a mile off the coast, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't have any navy to speak of. So the island city there continued after Nebuchadnezzar had died into the days of the Persian Empire and would continue all the way to the time of the coming of Alexander the Great. But when Alexander the Great came, he would capture the city by building a causeway from the mainland all the way out to the island city. And to look for materials for that causeway, he would take all of the city on the mainland, the ruins, the not so ruined areas, and he would use that as his building supplies. He would literally throw the island into the sea. If you go to Tyre today, over the years, that area has built up. The sand has sort of built up that causeway, and now it's turned into a regular peninsula where there at the end of the island there, or what used to be an island, now there is a fishing village. You can still see the harbors that are there today. Verse 5, he goes, notice Zechariah takes us from Tyre, moving southward. Ashkelon will see it and be afraid. Gaza too will writhe with great pain. Also, Ekron, for her expectation has been confounded. Moreover, the king will perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon will not be inhabited. And a mongrel race will dwell in Ashdod, and I will cut off the pride of the Philistines. Now, in case you hadn't gotten the name of those cities, that's okay. They are all Philistine cities, And the Philistine cities, Philistia is that area in southern Canaan, right along the coast, so just moving south from Sidon and Tyre. Alexander the Great, after capturing Tyre, came down against the cities of Philistia, actually had to capture Gaza because Gaza did not go down without a fight, but he was successful there, continuing on his way first to Egypt and then toward the rest of the Persian Empire. We get to verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Now, think about this. We've just read about a prophecy that was fulfilled in Alexander the Great, king of the Macedonian Empire. But here's a different king. Notice, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey. That was not Alexander the Great. You could call Alexander many things, you would not call him humble. You would not see him mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So this is, by contrast, a different king who comes amidst a triumphal shout to Jerusalem, because this is the king not from Greece, but the king who comes from Jerusalem. And of course, we recognize him immediately. This is a prophecy of the coming king, Jesus. Verse 10, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and he will speak peace to the nations. Notice all those things that were fighting and bickering before, that's all put aside. And instead, he will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea, and from the river, not just to the Persian Empire, but to the ends of the earth. Here comes one who is a greater conqueror even than Alexander the Great. Because Alexander comes, he reigns for a time, he conquers, and then he dies, and his kingdom is divided. But we worship a king whose kingdom will not end, it will continue forever. Verse 11, as for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. God says, I'm going to do something special for you. Why? Because I have a covenant with you. Notice the blood of the covenant. And Jesus came to bring the new and better covenant with his own blood. Verse 12, return to the stronghold, O prisoners who have the hope. This very day I am declaring that I will restore double to you, for I will bend Judah as my bow. I will fill the bow with Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece. You say, wait a minute, what's this about? I thought Greece was left behind when we stopped talking about Alexander. No, that was not the end of the story with Greece, because after Alexander's death, Greece continued to play a part in the history of Israel. Notice, and I will make you like a warrior's sword. You see what took place after Alexander died. His generals took his kingdom and broke it up between themselves. The ones that I want to talk about specifically are Ptolemy, who took the land of Egypt, and Seleucus, who took that land to the north of Israel, that included Anatolia and Syria and lots of other places that are off our map. But notice, to the north of Israel you had Seleucus, to the south of Israel you had Ptolemy. They were all Macedonians, but they weren't reigning from Macedonia. And little Judah in the middle. And that went on for quite a number of years, until finally you had a king in the north, a Seleucid king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, you've heard of the city of Antioch. There's several places called Antioch, and they are named after, actually, they're not named after Antiochus, they're named after his great-great-grandfather, but the name stuck around. Antiochus Epiphanes came down against the Ptolemies. And in the middle was little tiny Judah. And so Antiochus actually had arranged, he needed some extra cash, and so he had arranged for the high priest of Judah to have an accident and to put in his place a high priest of his own choosing who would pay off the bribes in order to have facilitated this change of priesthood. And this all took place initially undercover, but eventually the truth became known. Antiochus then found himself with a revolt on his hands, where the Jews eventually revolted. Um, the leaders of this revolt was the family of the Hasmoneans. We know them better, perhaps, as their nickname, the Maccabees. And the Maccabees revolted against this meddling in Jewish affairs. Antiochus actually tried to stamp out Judaism. He went into the temple and set up an abomination of desolation, a statue of a pagan god. And they revolted. They drove Antiochus out, and ultimately, it didn't happen overnight. It happened over many, many years, but they finally regained their independence. And so our story picks up, verse 14, then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. Now, this doesn't mean that God actually shows up with a literal bow and arrow, but that he is using the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, as his weapon of war. And the Lord God will blow the trumpet and will march in the storm winds of the south. Verse 15, the Lord of hosts will defend them, and they will devour and trample on the sling stones, and they will drink and be boisterous as with wine. They will be filled like a sacrificial basin, drenched like the corners of the altar. Notice the struggle that takes place. Verse 16, and the Lord their God will save them in that day. It's a promise of salvation as the flock of his people, for they are as the stones of a crown sparkling in his land. Notice the flock imagery. We're going to build on that, the idea of a flock and shepherds. That's going to continue on through the next chapter. Verse 17, for what comeliness and beauty will be theirs. Grain will make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins. Notice how it impacts the youth and it impacts everyone. We come to chapter 10 and verse 1. Ask rain from the Lord at the time of the spring rain, the Lord who makes the storm clouds, and he will give them showers of rain, vegetation in the field to each man. So there's a call to ask God for the rain, ask him for that which brings prosperity, and he is going to do it. He's going to accomplish that which is asked. Now, chapters 9 through chapter 11, then, we started off with judgment on Lebanon, and then we saw that God will rule over the nations. Alexander is going to be doing God's bidding. He will be doing God's rulership. In verses 11 through 17, God's going to save his sheep. And then we just saw the call for rain. Ask the Lord for rain. That's actually the pivotal point in this section. Next, we're going to see how God will save his sheep. Notice sheep are mentioned. I pointed it out before. It's going to be mentioned again. And then we'll see God ruling over the nations, but bringing exiles from those nations, from those far countries. That'll be in chapter 10, verses 8 through 12. And we will finally end in chapter 11 with a reference again to Lebanon. So this whole section is in this chiastic format. Chapter 10, verse 2, for the teraphim speak iniquity. Teraphim are pagan idols. And the diviners see lying visions and tell false dreams. They comfort in vain. Therefore, the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted because there is no shepherd. You see, the problem is that even though God brings salvation, even though God works in a mighty way, the people are like sheep and they are leaderless. They need a shepherd. No, let me change that. They need the good shepherd. Chapter 10, verse 3, my anger is kindled against the shepherds. Not the good shepherds, the bad shepherds. And I will punish the male goats, for the Lord of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Israel. Notice the shepherds and flock, that shepherd theme, and will make them like his majestic horse in battle. Verse 4, from them will come the cornerstone, from them the tent peg, from them the bow of battle, From them, every ruler, all of them together. Notice there's a war is brewing. It's getting ready for a great final conflict. Verse 5, they will be as mighty men, treading down the enemy in the mire of the streets in battle, and they will fight, for the Lord will be with them. Now, we saw that in the Maccabees. I think God was with them. I'm not saying that the Maccabees did everything they should have done, but I am saying that God brought about a deliverance. Notice, and the riders on horses will be put to shame. Um, the the Jewish people, they didn't have big cavalry. They didn't have horseback and so on. That was the Greeks who had that. And yet, even though they had the latest and greatest weaponry, they would be put to shame. Chapter 10, verse 6, I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph. In other words, God's saying, I'm going to save my people, and I will bring them back because I have had compassion on them, and they will be as though I had not rejected them. It's almost as though the Babylonian captivity never took place. I'm strengthening them. I'm taking them back, in a sense, to the good old days, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. And the idea is they ask, and now I am answering their prayers. So we started off, chapter 9 was judgment on Lebanon. Notice we've come full circle to talk about judgment on Lebanon again. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, open your doors, O Lebanon, that a fire may feed on your cedars. Wail, O Cyprus, for the cedar has fallen, because the glorious trees have been destroyed. Wail, O oaks of Bashan. Now, this isn't all in Lebanon. This is also to the east of the Sea of Galilee. For the impenetrable forest has come down. God is doing a work. He is burning things up. He is putting to flight the wicked. Verse 3, there is a sound of the shepherd's wail. Now, again, the shepherd's theme is coming back. For their glory is ruined. There is a sound of the young lion's roar. For the pride of the Jordan is ruined. Now, what we're going to see now, that shepherd theme, but it is a shepherd, a false shepherd. Sort of, we would say, the wolf in sheep's clothing. Verse 4, thus says the Lord my God, pasture the flock doomed to slaughter. Here's a flock. And when you're talking about the flock, remember that's the people of God. But in this case, we see them not successful, but rather doomed to slaughter. Why? Because they have bad shepherds. Those who buy them slay them and go unpunished. And each of those who sell them says, blessed be the Lord, for I have become rich. You see, the shepherds are becoming rich, not by taking care of the sheep, but by fleecing the sheep. And their own shepherds have no pity on them. Verse 6, for I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of the land, declares the Lord, but behold, I will cause the men to fall, each into another's power and into the power of his king, and they will strike the land, and I will not deliver them from their power. What a change. Before we saw God delivering, God bending the bow, God overcoming the cavalry, and yet now there's a change due to the bad shepherds and due to something else that we're going to see in just a few verses. So we have warning to the evil shepherds, that's verses 4 through 6. And now we're going to see how those shepherds are judged. Verse 7, so I pastured the flock, doomed to slaughter, hence the afflicted of the flock, and I took for myself 2 staffs. A staff is a shepherd's tool, a shepherd's ornament. The one I called favor, and the other I called union. That sounds like a wonderful thing. You have God has 2 staffs, favor and union, and so he pastured the flock. Verse 8, then I annihilated the 3 shepherds in 1 month. Those are the bad shepherds, for my soul was impatient with them, and their soul was also weary of me. Notice the shepherds didn't want God, and God didn't want these false shepherds. So you have a warning to the evil shepherds, and then the shepherds are judged, but now we're going to see those two staves where one is going to be broken. Eventually, both will be broken. Verse 9, then I said, I will not pasture you. What is to die, let it die. And what is to be annihilated, let it be annihilated. And let those who were left eat one another's flesh. And you say, is that symbolic? Or does that actually, in some literal way, take place? And if you know anything about the history of Israel, and specifically about the history of Jerusalem, you know that this might not just be literal. I'm sorry, figurative, that there might be a literal aspect in view. Verse 10, I took my staff, and notice this is a staff named Favor, and cut it in pieces to break my covenant. God is breaking his covenant because those with whom he had made the covenant have acted in a disloyal manner. Notice which I had made with all the peoples, so it was broken on that day, and thus the afflicted of the flock who were watching me realized that it was the word of the Lord. So notice we had the warning to evil shepherds, the shepherd's judge, the broken staff, and now notice the language of the price to the potter. Verse 12, I said to them, if it is good in your sight, give me my wages. But if not, never mind. So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver. Now, where have you read of this before in the Bible? They weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages, and then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that magnificent price at which I was valued by them. There's a touch of irony there. 30 shekels of silver was not considered a magnificent price. But the point is that the payment that they give for their betrayal amounts to this measly sum. So I threw the 30 shekels of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Now that echoes so much. You have to have recognized that this was fulfilled in Jesus, who was betrayed for 30 shekels of silver. And you remember what happened to the silver? Judas Iscariot, who had betrayed his Lord and Master, took those shekels and threw them into the temple, saying, I don't want that. Notice, throwing into the house of the Lord. And remember what took place? It was taken and it was used to buy the potter's field, to buy the field from the potter that would be the mark of the betrayal. That was all fulfilled in the person of Jesus. Throw it to the potter in the house of the Lord. All right, so we've seen the warning to the shepherds. The shepherds are judged, the broken staff, the price of the potter. Next, we see the second broken staff. This is mentioned in verse 14. Then I cut in pieces my second staff, union, instead of unity in Israel. There's going to be a great amount of disunity to break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. You see, Judah and Israel had in the past been divided, but as of recent times, there's been a union and a unity, but now it's going to go to pieces again, where there will no longer be a unity. There will now be a division, family against family, one house against another. Division is on its way. Next, we have the picture of foolish shepherds. Remember, the shepherds are judged back in chapter 11, verses 7 and 8. Now, in verses 15 and 16, we have the picture of these foolish shepherds. Verse 15, the Lord said to me, take again for yourself the equipment, here it is, of a foolish shepherd. For behold, I'm going to raise up a shepherd in the land who will not care for the perishing, seek the scattered, heal the broken, or sustain the one standing, but will devour the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hooves. You didn't want the good shepherd? In that case, I'm going to give you evil shepherds. And so we come full circle, the foolish shepherds, and finally in verse 17, there's going to be woe to the worthless which amounts to the same thing, the evil shepherd, the worthless shepherd. Verse 17, woe to the worthless shepherd, that one who leaves the flock. Remember how Jesus spoke about how he was a good shepherd. But woe to those hirelings who just abandon the flock when danger comes. A sword will be on his arm and on his right eye. His arm will be totally withered, and his right eye will be blind. Jesus talked about spiritual blindness to those who deemed themselves as the shepherds of Israel. The passage is given in John chapter 9, beginning in verse 39, where Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see." He's speaking this on the heels of having healed a blind man, but also that those who see may become blind. Now, what did he mean by this? Verse 40, those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we? Are you calling us spiritually blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." You see, it's one thing to be spiritually blind and know it, and to go to the one who is able to give you spiritual sight. It is another thing entirely to say, "I have spiritual insight, I can see," but in reality, to be blind. Take your blindness to the Lord who gives sight to the blind, repenting of your blindness and turning to him so that he can give you spiritual insight.